Bank staff kicks elderly woman to the curb until Shaq walks in and changes everything. The morning sun filtered through the glass doors of First Capital Bank, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The usual Monday rush was in full swing, with people shuffling in lines and bank tellers typing away at their computers. The air conditioning hummed steadily, barely masking the low murmur of conversations and the occasional ding of the customer service bell. Maria stood just inside the entrance, her weathered hands clutching both her wooden cane and a worn leather folder filled with papers. At 82, she wasn't as steady on her feet as she used to be, but her eyes remained sharp and alert as she surveyed the busy lobby. She'd been coming to this same bank for over 40 years, back when it was still called Community Trust and had real plants instead of the plastic ones that now decorated the corners. The bank had changed so much since then. Gone were the familiar faces she'd known for decades, replaced by young people who seemed more interested in their computer screens than the customers. The old wooden counters had given way to sleek metal and glass partitions, and where there once were comfortable chairs for elderly customers, now stood rows of ATMs with their bright, confusing screens. Maria adjusted her cardigan and gripped her cane tighter. She needed to get this done quickly. Robert's medicine couldn't wait. Her husband of 60 years was back at home, probably sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, waiting for her to return with his heart medication. The doctor had called yesterday evening about the new prescription, warning that they shouldn't skip a single dose. The line inched forward slowly. Maria could feel the strain in her legs, but there weren't any free seats nearby. A young mother with 2 small children stood behind her, the little ones fidgeting and whining about being bored. Maria turned and gave them a gentle smile, remembering when her own children were that age. Now they lived in different states, busy with their own lives and families. "Would you like to go ahead of me?" Maria offered to the young mother, who looked stressed trying to manage both children. "Oh no, please, you were here first," the mother replied, struggling to keep her younger child from running off. "Tommy, stay right here." Maria watched as more customers filtered in through the revolving door. Business people in suits clutching their phones, college students with backpacks, and workers on their lunch break. All of them seemed to know exactly what they were doing, tapping away at their phones or using the ATMs with practiced ease. She glanced down at her folder of documents. Inside were her original bank account documents from 1982, her social security card, slightly worn at the edges but still perfectly legible, and the power of attorney papers she and Robert had signed years ago. She'd always been careful with important documents, keeping them safe in a fireproof box under their bed. Robert used to tease her about being too cautious, but she knew better. Paper was reliable. Paper couldn't crash like those computers everyone depended on nowadays. The line moved forward again, and Maria shuffled along with it. Through the glass walls, she could see the bank employees rushing back and forth between desks, some carrying tablets, others talking on headsets. Everything seemed so fast-paced now, so different from the careful, personal service she remembered. Back then, Mr. Thompson, the old manager, knew everyone by name and would often ask about their families. He'd even attended Robert's retirement party 15 years ago. A security guard stood near the front desk, his eyes constantly scanning the lobby. Maria remembered when the bank didn't need security guards, when people would greet each other like neighbors, because that's what they were. Now everyone was a stranger, and everything needed passwords and special cards and fingerprint scans. The air conditioning made her shoulders feel stiff, and she wished she'd brought a warmer sweater. But there hadn't been time for that this morning, not after the doctor's call about Robert's medicine. The new prescription would cost more than they'd planned for this month, and their pension payment wasn't due for another week. That's why she needed to make this withdrawal today, even though it wasn't their usual banking day. Finally, she reached the front of the line. A young woman with bright red lipstick and perfectly manicured nails gestured for her to approach the counter. Maria moved forward carefully, placing her folder of documents on the counter surface. The nameplate on the desk read Jessica, though the teller hardly looked up from her computer screen as Maria approached. "Good morning," Maria said, her voice warm despite her growing anxiety about Robert's medication. "I need to make a withdrawal from my account." Jessica's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Do you have your ATM card with you?"
No, Dir.
I've never needed one before. I have all my documents right here, Maria explained, starting to open her folder. The papers inside were organized chronologically. She'd always been proud of her filing system. The teller's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together slightly. Ma'am, we can't process transactions without proper digital identification now. It's bank policy. Maria's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out her original account documents. But I've been banking here for 40 years.
See?
Here's my account number and my signature card. She spread the papers carefully on the counter. Several people in line behind her shifted impatiently. Maria could hear someone sigh loudly, and her cheeks grew warm. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She just needed to get Robert's medicine. I understand, Jessica said, though her tone suggested otherwise, but we've updated our security protocols. Everything's digital now. You'll need to register for online banking and get a proper ATM card. She pushed a glossy brochure across the counter. Here's information about how to set up your digital account. Maria stared at the brochure with its pictures of smiling people looking at phones and computers. The text was too small to read without her reading glasses, which she'd left at home in her hurry to get to the bank. But I need the money today, Maria explained, her voice getting slightly higher with worry. It's for my husband's heart medication. The doctor called yesterday, and we need to start him on the new prescription right away. Jessica glanced at the growing line behind Maria, then pressed a button on her desk. Let me get my supervisor to explain the situation. While they waited, Maria carefully gathered her documents back into the folder. Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and one of the papers slipped, floating to the floor. Before she could figure out how to bend down with her cane to retrieve it, a young man in line behind her picked it up and handed it to her with a kind smile. Thank you, she said gratefully. At least some people still remembered their manners. A tall man in a dark suit approached the counter, his badge identifying him as a floor supervisor. His name was David, and he couldn't have been more than 35, younger than Maria's youngest son. Is there a problem here? He asked, looking between Jessica and Maria. This lady wants to make a withdrawal, but she doesn't have any digital identification or an ATM card, Jessica explained quickly, clearly eager to move on to her next customer. David turned to Maria with what seemed like practiced patience. Ma'am, I understand you've been with our bank for a long time, but we've modernized our systems for everyone's security. We can't process transactions without proper digital verification. Maria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She hadn't cried in public since Robert's heart attack 3 years ago, and she wasn't about to start now. Please, she said, her voice steady despite her growing desperation. My husband needs his medicine. We've never missed a payment, never overdrawn our account. Surely there must be some way. The supervisor's expression remained unchanged. I'm sorry, but we have strict protocols. You'll need to set up digital banking first. We can help you with that process, but it will take a few days to verify everything and issue your cards. Maria looked down at her folder of documents, then at her cane, then at the long line of people behind her. She felt very small suddenly, very old, and very out of place in this modern world of screens and passwords. A few days, she repeated quietly. But Robert needs his medicine today. David gestured toward the entrance. Perhaps you have a family member who could help you set up digital banking? Or someone who could lend you the money until your account is properly set up. Their children all lived out of state. Their neighbors were nice enough, but Maria couldn't imagine asking them for money. And Robert, proud, dignified Robert, would be mortified if she started borrowing money from strangers. The security guard was moving closer now, obviously noting the growing tension at the counter. Maria could feel the weight of everyone's stares, hear the impatient shuffling of feet behind her. This bank, which had been like a second home to her for so many years, suddenly felt as alien as a spaceship. The security guard took a step closer, his polished name badge catching the fluorescent light. Is everything all right here? He asked, though his question seemed directed more at David than at Maria. I think we're done here, David said firmly. I'm sorry, ma'am, but without proper digital identification, there's nothing we can do today. Maria's fingers tightened around her cane. She thought of Robert at home, probably wondering why she was taking so long. He'd been looking pale this morning, more tired than usual. The doctor's words from last night echoed in her mind. It's crucial he starts this medication as soon as possible. Please, she tried one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. I can show you my driver's license. I have our marriage certificate, our tax returns, everything that proves who I am. She began pulling more documents from her folder, her hands shaking slightly as she laid them on the counter. David glanced at the growing pile of papers with visible discomfort. Ma'am, those documents aren't the issue. We need digital verification. It's bank policy and we can't make exceptions, even for long-time customers. A young woman in line spoke up from behind Maria. Some of us have jobs to get back to. Can't she just come back another day? Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. In all her years, she'd never been made to feel like a nuisance at her own bank. She remembered when she and Robert had opened their account here, how the teller had spent nearly an hour helping them choose the right type of savings plan for their growing family. Now she couldn't even withdraw her own money. The security guard moved closer, his presence becoming more obvious. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up the line. But this is my bank, Maria said, her voice cracking slightly. I've been coming here every month since before any of you were born. Robert and I helped fund the children's reading corner in the old building. She gestured toward where the reading corner used to be, now replaced by a row of ATMs. Jessica had already turned her attention to her computer screen, clearly considering the conversation over. David straightened his tie and nodded to the security guard. Mr. Thompson, please escort this lady to the exit. We can't help her today. The irony of the guard sharing a name with the old bank manager wasn't lost on Maria. But this Mr. Thompson wasn't the kind, grandfatherly figure who used to run the bank. This one was just doing his job, gently but firmly taking her elbow to guide her away from the counter. Don't touch me, Maria said quietly but firmly, pulling her arm away. I can walk on my own. She began gathering her documents, trying to maintain what dignity she had left. One of the papers slipped again, but this time no one moved to help her pick it up. As she slowly bent to retrieve it, her joints protesting, she could hear David already calling the next customer forward. The young mother she'd offered to let ahead in line earlier caught her eye with a sympathetic look, but quickly glanced away when Maria tried to smile back. The walk to the exit felt longer than ever. Each step with her cane echoed against the marble floor, matching the heavy beating of her heart. The security guard followed a few steps behind, as if she might suddenly try to make a run for the counter. The thought would have made her laugh if she weren't so close to tears. Near the exit, she passed the customer service wall of fame, where employee photos were displayed. Her eyes caught on the empty space where Margaret's picture used to hang, dear Margaret, who'd helped them set up college funds for all three of their children. Margaret would have known what to do today. She would have found a way to help. The morning sun that had seemed so bright when she entered now felt harsh and exposing as she stepped outside. The security guard held the door open, his face professionally blank. Have a nice day, ma'am, he said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. Maria stood on the sidewalk, clutching her folder and cane, feeling more lost than she had in years. The medicine would cost $300, money they had but couldn't access. Robert had always handled their banking, but since his first heart attack, she'd taken over managing their finances. She'd been so proud of herself for keeping everything organized, for learning to balance their checkbook and pay their bills on time. But now all that counted for nothing because she couldn't navigate this new digital world. A young couple walked past her into the bank, both of them tapping away at their phones. Through the glass doors, she could see life continuing as normal inside, people making deposits, checking their accounts, going about their day. The world had changed around her, and somehow she'd missed the moment when everything she knew became obsolete. She moved to one of the benches outside the bank, needing to rest her legs and gather her thoughts. The morning was getting warmer, and she could feel sweat beginning to form under her cardigan. A city bus pulled up at the stop across the street, and she watched as passengers got on and off, most of them scanning their passes on some kind of digital reader. Her own bus pass was a piece of paper with stamps on it, probably as outdated as her bank documents. She wondered if the bus driver would even accept it anymore. The thought made her chest tight with anxiety. Taking a deep breath, she opened her folder again and looked through her documents. Each piece of paper represented a milestone in their lives. The original account opening forms from when Robert got his promotion at the factory, the college savings accounts for the kids, the retirement planning documents they'd filled out together. All officially stamped, all carefully preserved, and all apparently worthless now. A few people gave her curious glances as they passed by, probably wondering why an elderly woman was sitting alone outside the bank with papers spread across her lap. She must look like a confused old lady to them, someone who couldn't keep up with the times. The thought stung more than she wanted to admit. Inside her wallet, she found the business card for their family doctor. Maybe if she called him, he could write a letter explaining the urgency of Robert's situation. But that would take time they didn't have, and besides, would the bank even accept a doctor's letter if it wasn't in some digital format? She thought about calling their children. Michael, their oldest, was good with computers. He was always trying to get them to use something called online banking. But he was in Seattle, probably in the middle of an important meeting. Sarah was traveling for work this week, and Tommy had his hands full with the new twins. The sound of laughter drew her attention back to the bank's entrance. A group of teenagers was walking out, all of them looking at something on one of their phones. They made it look so easy, this digital world that had sprung up around her. When had she fallen so far behind? Robert would know what to do. He'd always been better at handling difficult situations, always knew the right person to talk to or the right questions to ask. But Robert was at home, waiting for his medicine, probably worried sick about where she was. She should have asked one of the neighbors to come with her, someone younger who understood all these new requirements. Maria checked her watch, the same watch Robert had given her on their 50th anniversary. It was almost 11 now. The pharmacy would close at 6, and they needed to get the prescription filled today. The doctor had been very clear about that. She could see David through the bank windows, talking to another customer. His posture was relaxed now, friendly even. He smiled as he pointed at something on his computer screen, probably explaining some digital service or another. The sight made her wonder if she should go back in, try one more time to explain her situation. Maybe if she spoke to someone higher up, but the memory of those impatient stares, the security guard's firm grip on her elbow, the dismissive tone in Jessica's voice, it all kept her rooted to the bench. In 62 years of marriage, through raising 3 children, through Robert's heart attack and her own battle with arthritis, she'd never felt this helpless. A warm breeze rustled her papers, and she carefully tucked them back into her folder. She needed to think of something else, find another way. Robert had always said she was the creative one in the family, the one who could make something out of nothing when times were tight. But this was different. This wasn't about stretching a dollar or making do with less. This was about being locked out of their own money, because she couldn't prove who she was in the right way. The bank's glass doors opened again, and she instinctively tensed, expecting to see the security guard coming to tell her she couldn't sit on the bench. Instead, a tall figure emerged, someone who would change the course of her morning in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Maria watched as more customers entered and left the bank, each one reminding her that time was slipping away. Robert would be getting worried by now. He always fretted when she was gone too long. Taking a deep breath, she gripped her cane and pushed herself up from the bench. She hadn't come all this way just to give up. Back inside, the air conditioning hit her like a wall of cold air. The morning rush had died down somewhat, but there was still a steady stream of customers. This time, Maria walked straight to the information desk, where a young woman was directing people to different departments. "I need to speak with the manager," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's urgent." The receptionist looked up from her tablet. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I've been a customer here for 40 years. Please, it won't take long." After a moment's hesitation and a few taps on her tablet, the receptionist picked up her phone. "Mr. Chen? There's a customer here insisting on speaking with you," she says. She glanced at Maria. "What was your name?" "Maria Delgado." "My husband is Robert Delgado." A few minutes later, a man in his early 30s emerged from the glass-walled office area. His suit was impeccably pressed, and his shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He had the polished look of someone who'd stepped straight out of a business school textbook. "Mrs. Delgado? I'm James Chun, the branch manager. How can I help you today?" His tone was professional but distant, the kind of voice used to deliver practiced responses. Maria clutched her folder closer. "Your tellers won't let me withdraw money for my husband's medicine. They say I need something digital, but Robert needs his heart medication today. Please, there must be something you can do." Mr. Chin gestured toward his office. "Let's discuss this privately." The manager's office was all glass and chrome, with a large screen mounted on one wall displaying graphs and numbers. Maria sank into one of the sleek chairs, her joints grateful for the rest. She placed her folder on his desk, next to a small forest of awards for digital banking innovation. "Mrs. Delgado," Mr. Chin began, folding his hands on his desk, "I understand your frustration, but our security protocols are in place for a reason. We have a duty to protect our customers' assets." "I'm not asking you to break any rules," Maria said, opening her folder. "Look, here's my driver's license, our original account documents, even pictures of Robert and me at the bank's community events. We used to volunteer at all of them, back when the bank still did community events." Mr. Chin glanced at the documents without touching them. "The issue isn't your identity, Mrs. Delgado. We're living in a digital age. Our systems are designed to prevent fraud and protect our customers. Without proper digital verification, I legally cannot authorize any withdrawals." "But this is an emergency," Maria insisted, her voice rising slightly. "My husband needs his medicine. We have the money, our own money, right here in your bank. How can you just—" "Mrs. Delgado," Mr. Chin interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of condescension, "I sympathize with your situation, but we have thousands of elderly customers who have successfully transitioned to digital banking. My team would be happy to help you set up online access and a proper ATM card. We can even schedule a digital banking workshop for seniors next week." Maria felt her hands begin to shake. "Next week? Robert needs his medicine today," the doctor said. "Perhaps you could borrow from a family member until your digital access is set up?" Mr. Chin suggested, already reaching for his phone, clearly ready to end the conversation. "Our children live across the country," Maria said, fighting to keep her composure. "And our neighbors, we can't." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Chin, when your bank was still Community Trust, they helped us set up college funds for all 3 of our children. When the factory laid Robert off in '89, Mr. Thompson, the old manager, he worked with us to keep our house. This bank used to care about people, not just policies." Mr. Chen's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Delgado, I respect your history with our institution, but times have changed. We have regulations to follow, security protocols to maintain. I cannot make exceptions, even for long-time customers." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time she didn't try to hold them back. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked quietly. "To have money you've saved your whole life, but can't use it when you need it most? To be treated like you're invisible just because you don't understand all these new technologies." Through the glass walls, she could see bank employees glancing their way. A small crowd had gathered near the information desk, probably wondering why an elderly woman was crying in the manager's office. "My husband is sitting at home right now," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. "He worked at the factory for 45 years, never missed a day. We saved everything we could, paid our bills on time, did everything right. And now you're telling me I can't access our own money because I don't have the right kind of card?" Mr. Chin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mrs. Delgado, I understand this is emotional for you, but—" "No, you don't understand." Maria cut him off, surprising herself with her firmness. "You don't understand what it's like to watch the world change so fast around you that suddenly nothing makes sense anymore. To have everything you relied on, everything you trusted, become obsolete overnight." She pulled out a yellowed photograph from her folder, a picture from the bank's 15th anniversary celebration. In it, She and Robert stood proudly next to the old manager, all of them smiling in front of the community trust sign. We're not just account numbers, you know. We're people. Real people with real emergencies. Your computers might not recognize my papers, but they're just as valid as they were 40 years ago. I'm still the same Maria Delgado who opened that account. Robert is still the same man who trusted this bank with our life savings. Mr. Chen glanced at his computer screen, then back at Maria. I understand your frustration, but my hands are tied. Bank policy is very clear about this. Without digital verification, I cannot authorize any transactions. It's a matter of security. Security? Maria's voice rose slightly. I'm an 82-year-old woman with a cane and 40 years of documented history with this bank. What kind of security risk do you think I pose? Through the glass walls, more people had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out, probably recording the scene. Maria could see David, the floor supervisor from earlier, speaking urgently into his headset. Mrs. Delgado, Mr. Chen said, standing up, I think we're done here. I'll have someone escort you out. Done. Maria gripped her cane tighter. No, we're not done. I'm not leaving until you help me get Robert's medicine. What kind of people have you become? What kind of bank turns away its oldest customers in their time of need? The security guard, Mr. Thompson, appeared at the office door. Sir, do you need assistance? Mr. Chen nodded. Please escort Mrs. Delgado out of the building. And call the police if she refuses to leave. The police? Maria's voice cracked. You'd call the police on me? For trying to get medicine for my sick husband. More phones were out now, more people watching. Maria could hear whispers, see the disapproving looks some customers were giving the bank staff. But Mr. Chen's expression remained unchanged, his commitment to policy unwavering. As the security guard stepped forward, the main doors of the bank swung open. A tall figure entered, accompanied by a teenage girl. The crowd near the information desk parted automatically, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Maria didn't recognize him at first. Her eyes were still blurry with tears. But she heard the whispers ripple through the crowd, saw the sudden change in Mr. Chen's expression, and realized that something extraordinary was about to happen. The security guard's hand dropped from Maria's elbow as the newcomer approached, his presence filling the glass-walled office in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. And in that moment, as Maria wiped her eyes with a trembling hand, she realized that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Shaquille O'Neal's presence seemed to make the bank's modern office feel suddenly small. He ducked slightly coming through the glass door, his teenage daughter right behind him, her eyes already fixed on the scene unfolding in the manager's office. The whispers around them grew louder, phones raised higher, but Shaq's attention was focused entirely on the elderly woman with tears in her eyes. Everything okay in here? His deep voice carried easily through the now quiet bank lobby. He spoke softly, but with the kind of authority that made everyone, including Mr. Chen, straighten up a little. Maria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue from her purse, not quite believing what she was seeing. She recognized him, of course. Even someone who didn't follow basketball knew Shaquille O'Neal. But it was the genuine concern in his voice, not his celebrity, that made her speak. They won't let me get money for my husband's medicine, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Because I don't have their digital things. Shaq glanced at his daughter, who was already pulling out her phone. Wait here, baby girl. Let me see what's going on. He approached the office, and Mr. Chen scrambled to his feet, his professional demeanor shifting to something more nervous. Mr. O'Neal, what an unexpected pleasure. I apologize for this situation. We're just explaining our security protocols to Mrs. Delgado. Shaq raised an eyebrow, turning to Maria. Ma'am, would you mind telling me what's happening? The whole story. Maria found herself explaining everything about Robert's medicine, their 40 years with the bank, the digital requirements, all of it. As she spoke, Shaq pulled up one of the office chairs, which looked comically small under his frame, and listened intently. He didn't interrupt, didn't check his phone, just nodded occasionally and kept his eyes on her. Let me get this straight, he said when she finished. Your husband needs heart medicine today. You have money in this bank. Money you've had here for 40 years. But they won't let you access it because you don't have a digital ID? That's correct, Mr. O'Neill, Mr. Chin interjected. But you have to understand our security protocols. Hold up, Shaq raised his hand, still looking at Maria. Ma'am, do you have any ID with you? Maria nodded, pulling out her driver's license and social security card. Shaq looked them over, then at the pile of documents on Mr. Chen's desk. His daughter had wandered closer, standing just outside the office, her phone now lowered as she watched her father handle the situation. You know, Shaq said, his voice thoughtful, this reminds me of my mama. She's not much younger than you, ma'am. Used to tell me stories about when banks actually knew their customers by name. When they understood that behind every account was a real person with real needs. He turned to Mr. Chin, and though his voice remained calm, there was steel beneath the surface. My mama taught me something important. She said technology should help people, not hurt them. Looks to me like your protocols are doing more hurting than helping right now. Mr. Chin shifted uncomfortably. Mr. O'Neill, while I appreciate your concern, we have strict policies. Let me tell you about policies, Shaq interrupted, his voice still gentle but firm. When I was growing up, we didn't have much. There were times my mama needed help, and let me tell you, it wasn't policies that helped us, it was people. People who understood that sometimes you need to look beyond the rules to do what's right. The crowd outside the office had grown larger. Bank employees hovered uncertainly near their desks, customers pressed against the glass walls, phones recording every word. Shaq's daughter had moved closer to Maria, offering her a fresh tissue with a kind smile. You see all these people watching? Shaq gestured to the crowd. They're not just watching an old lady cry because she can't get her husband's medicine. They're watching to see what kind of institution you really are. Are you a bank that serves its community, or just a bunch of computers saying no to people in need? Maria watched as Mr. Chen's professional facade began to crack. The manager glanced at his computer screen, then at the growing crowd, then back at Shaq. Mr. O'Neill, I understand what you're saying, but our digital security measures are designed to protect our customers. Protect them from what? Shaq asked, picking up the photograph Maria had shown earlier. From their own history? This lady and her husband have been putting their trust in your bank longer than you've been alive. That counts for something, or at least it should. He handed the photo to his daughter, who studied it with interest. Dad, she said quietly, look at the date on this. They've been coming here since before you played basketball. Shaq nodded, a small smile crossing his face. You know what that means? It means they've been loyal to this bank longer than I've been famous. Longer than most people in this building have had bank accounts. He turned back to Mr. Chin. That kind of loyalty should earn them something better than being treated like strangers. Maria felt warmth spread through her chest, not just from Shaq's words, but from the way he was treating her, like a person who deserved respect, not a problem to be managed. His daughter had pulled up a chair next to her, quietly asking about the other photos in her folder, showing genuine interest in the stories behind them. I remember when banks used to have community appreciation days, Shaq continued, his voice carrying easily through the quiet lobby. My mama would take me, and there'd be cookies and lemonade, and the managers would know everyone's name. Sure, times change, but that doesn't mean we have to lose our humanity in the process. He leaned forward, his massive frame making Mr. Chen's desk look like something from a dollhouse. Now, I came here today to handle some business of my own, but I'm not doing anything until we figure out how to help Mrs. Delgado get her husband's medicine. And I've got all day, do you? The implications of having Shaquille O'Neal sitting in his office, potentially for hours, clearly registered on Mr. Chen's face. The manager glanced at his computer again, then at the crowd of phone-wielding observers, then at Maria's tear-stained face. There might be a way, he said slowly. We do have emergency protocols for exceptional circumstances. That's what I'm talking about, Shaq smiled, but his eyes remained serious. Sometimes you've got to look at the spirit of the rules, not just the letter. Mrs. Delgado isn't trying to hack your system or commit fraud. She's trying to take care of her husband, something she's probably been doing longer than any of us have been alive. Maria watched as Mr. Chen began typing on his computer, his fingers moving faster now. Through the glass walls, she could see some of the tension in the lobby beginning to ease, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Shaq's daughter was still looking through her photos, asking questions about the community events and the old bank building, treating each yellowed picture like a precious piece of history. For the first time since she'd walked into the bank that morning, Maria felt like herself again, not just an old woman fighting against a system she didn't understand, but a person with a story worth hearing, a history worth respecting. And sometimes, she was learning that's all it takes, someone willing to listen, to understand, and to stand up for what's right. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted completely. What had started as a private conflict had become something larger, with dozens of witnesses holding their phones steady, capturing every moment. Mr. Chen's fingers continued moving across his keyboard, but his earlier confidence had evaporated under Shaq's steady gaze. "You know," Shaq said, breaking the tense silence, "I've been thinking about something my business professor told me years ago. He said the best companies don't just follow protocols, they create solutions." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked slightly under his weight. "So, let's create a solution here." Mr. Chen cleared his throat. "The emergency protocols require executive approval for any override of digital authentication. I've sent a request, but then let's call them," Shaq said simply, pulling out his own phone. "What's the number? I'm sure they'd be interested in hearing about this situation directly from me." Maria watched as the color drained slightly from Mr. Chen's face. His eyes darted to the growing crowd outside his office, where people were now openly discussing the situation, some shaking their heads in disapproval at the bank's treatment of an elderly customer. "That won't be necessary, Mr. O'Neill," Mr. Chen said quickly. "I'm sure we can resolve this internally." Shaq's daughter, who had been quietly scrolling through something on her phone, spoke up. "Dad, this is already trending locally. People are sharing it with hashtags about elder rights and banking accessibility." The news seemed to hit Mr. Chen like a physical blow. He looked at his computer screen again, then at Maria, then at the crowd of observers. The story was spreading beyond the bank's walls, beyond his control. "Mrs. Delgado," he said, his voice notably softer now, "perhaps we could verify your identity through alternative means. Your long history with the bank does count for something." "Now that's more like it," Shaq nodded approvingly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means finding a new way when the old ways don't work." Maria sat up straighter, hope returning to her features. "I have everything here, our original account documents, photos from bank events, even letters from the old manager, Mr. Thompson. And I'm right here witnessing all of it," Shaq added, his voice carrying just enough weight to make it clear this wasn't just a suggestion. "Pretty sure my word counts for something when it comes to confirming someone's identity." Mr. Chen began typing again, more purposefully this time. "There is a legacy verification protocol we can use. It's rarely activated these days, but..." He paused, reading something on his screen. "Yes, here it is. For customers with accounts predating our digital systems, we can establish identity through historical documentation and in-person verification by a bank officer." "See," Shaq smiled. "Solutions exist if you're willing to look for them. Sometimes they're right there in your own system, just waiting to be used." Through the glass walls, David, the floor supervisor from earlier, was watching with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Other bank employees had gathered as well, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that looked like shame. "The verification process will take a few minutes," Mr. Chen said, his professional demeanor attempting to reassert itself. "We'll need to document everything carefully." "Take all the time you need," Shaq replied, settling more comfortably in his chair. "I'm not going anywhere until Mrs. Delgado gets what she came for. And while we wait..." He turned to Maria with genuine interest. "I'd love to hear more about those community events in your photos. Looks like this bank used to really be part of people's lives." As Maria began sharing stories about the bank's history, pulling out more photographs from her folder, the tension in the office began to dissolve. She told them about the Christmas Savings Club parties, the summer picnics where bank employees and customers would gather in the park across the street, the financial literacy classes Robert used to teach for local high school students. Shaq's daughter recorded some of the stories on her phone, treating them like precious pieces of history. Even Mr. Chin found himself drawn in, particularly when Maria described how the bank had helped local businesses survive the recession in the 1980s. "That's what banking should be about," Shaq commented, looking pointedly at Mr. Chin. "Not just transactions and protocols, but being part of the community, understanding people's needs, helping them through tough times." The manager's computer chimed with an incoming message. He read it quickly, his expression shifting from concern to relief. "The override has been approved. We can process Mrs. Delgado's withdrawal now." "And for the future?" Shaq pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "We should talk about making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just for Mrs. Delgado, but for all your elderly customers." Mr. Chin nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. We can set up a special verification protocol for Mrs. Delgado's account, and..." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Perhaps we should review our policies for all our long-term customers. Create a better bridge between our traditional and digital banking services." "Now you're thinking like a leader," Shaq smiled. "Sometimes it takes a challenge to help us see where we need to improve." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she filled out the withdrawal slip, the same kind she'd been using for 40 years. This time, no one suggested she use an ATM instead. The young teller who processed the transaction, a different one from earlier, treated her with careful respect, taking time to count out the bills twice and make sure everything was in order. Through the glass walls, the crowd had begun to disperse, though many people lingered, watching the resolution of a story they'd become unexpectedly invested in. Some were still recording, but the atmosphere had changed from outrage to satisfaction, from protest to appreciation. "Mrs. Delgado," Mr. Chin said as the transaction was completed, "I want to apologize for our earlier treatment of you. You deserved better from us. Your history with this bank should have counted for more." "Thank you," Maria replied softly, carefully placing the money in her purse. "Robert will be so relieved." She turned to Shaq and his daughter. "And thank you both. I don't know what I would have done if..." "No thanks needed," Shaq interrupted gently. "Sometimes people just need a reminder of what's really important. Technology is great, but it should bring us together, not push us apart." As Maria gathered her documents, Mr. Chin cleared his throat. "Mrs. Delgado, if you'd be willing, we'd like to set up a meeting next week to talk about how we can better serve our elderly customers. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable." Maria looked surprised, then pleased. "I'd like that. Robert too, if he's feeling better. He always said banks need to remember they're serving people, not just accounts." "Wise man, you're Robert," Shaq nodded, standing up carefully to avoid bumping his head on the office ceiling. "Now, how about we make sure you get home safely? My daughter and I were just about to have lunch. Would you join us? You can tell us more about those community picnics." The earlier despair that had brought Maria to tears felt like a distant memory now. As she walked out of the bank between Shaq and his daughter, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes come not from standing alone against a system, but from finding unexpected allies who understand that some things, like dignity, respect, and human connection, never go out of date. The small diner across from the bank buzzed with afternoon activity as Maria sat in a booth with Shaq and his daughter. Her purse, now containing the money for Robert's medicine, rested securely beside her. The warmth of the restaurant and the aroma of coffee helped ease the last of the morning's tension from her shoulders. "You got to try the pie here," Shaq said, gesturing to the dessert display. "My treat." His massive frame made the regular-sized booth look like doll furniture, but he seemed completely at ease, showing none of the intimidating presence he'd used in the bank manager's office. "Dad always finds the best diners," his daughter added, smiling at Maria. "He says they have more soul than fancy restaurants." As they waited for their food, Maria called Robert from the diner's phone. Her old flip phone had run out of battery during the morning's ordeal. His voice, worried but relieved, brought tears to her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "Everything's fine now, mi amor," she assured him. "I'll be home soon with your medicine. And wait until I tell you who helped me." She glanced at Shaq, who was pretending not to listen as he studied the menu. You won't believe it. After she hung up, their food arrived. Simple sandwiches and soup, nothing fancy, but it felt like a feast after the morning's events. As they ate, Maria found herself sharing more stories about the old days at the bank, and Shaq listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing his own memories of growing up in a changing world. You know, he said, carefully handling a spoon that looked tiny in his massive hands, what happened today? It's not just about one bank or one person. It's about how we treat people in a world that's moving too fast sometimes. His daughter nodded, looking up from her phone. The video's got thousands of views already. People are calling it Banking with Heart and sharing their own stories about elderly relatives struggling with digital systems. Maria's eyes widened. Video? You mean people recorded? Don't worry, Shaq assured her quickly. The comments are all supporting you. Sometimes it takes something like this to remind people what really matters. Through the diner's windows, they could see the bank across the street. The morning crowd had thinned, but there was something different about the place now. Through the glass walls, Maria could see Mr. Chun in what appeared to be an intense meeting with his staff. They're going to change things, Shaq's daughter said confidently. They have to. The internet won't let them forget this. Maria watched as a young man helped an elderly customer at the ATM, taking time to explain each step. It was a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something important. The world's changing fast, Shaq reflected, but that doesn't mean we have to leave people behind. My mama always says progress is good, but not if it costs us our humanity. The waitress brought their pie, warm apple with vanilla ice cream. As Maria took her first bite, she realized she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, too worried about Robert and the bank situation to think about food. After we get your husband's medicine, Shaq said, I'd like to have my foundation look into setting up a program. Something to help bridge the gap between traditional and digital banking for seniors. Would you be interested in being part of that? Maria paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. Me? Who better? Shaq smiled. You've lived it. You understand what needs to change. Sometimes the best solutions come from the people who've faced the biggest challenges. As they finished their lunch, more people from the bank began filtering into the diner for their lunch breaks. Some nodded respectfully in their direction. Others looked embarrassed, remembering their role in the morning's events. A few even stopped to apologize to Maria personally. The young teller who had initially turned her away approached their table hesitantly. Mrs. Delgado? I wanted to say I'm sorry about this morning. I should have tried harder to help. Maria smiled gently. We all learn, dear. That's what life is about. After lunch, Shaq insisted on driving Maria to the pharmacy himself. His daughter sat in the back of his specially sized SUV, still documenting everything on her phone for the foundation, she said. The pharmacist's eyes went wide when Shaquille O'Neal ducked through his door, but he quickly focused on filling Robert's prescription. You know, Shaq said as they waited, what happened today wasn't just about getting medicine. It was about dignity, about remembering that behind every policy, every rule, there's a human story. Maria clutched the pharmacy bag, feeling the weight of the morning's victory. I never thought I'd say this, but maybe it was good that they turned me away at first. Sometimes things have to go wrong before they can get better. The drive to Maria and Robert's house was filled with comfortable conversation. Shaq's daughter asked about the neighborhood, about how it had changed over the years, genuinely interested in the history of this small corner of the city. When they pulled up to the modest house with its well-tended garden, Robert was waiting on the porch. His face showed traces of worry, but his eyes lit up when he saw his wife stepping out of the enormous SUV. Then his jaw dropped as Shaquille O'Neal unfolded himself from the driver's seat. Maria, he called out weakly, am I seeing things? Not today, mi amor, she laughed, hurrying up the path with his medicine. Today, miracles are real. Over coffee in their kitchen, Shaq sitting carefully on a reinforced old chair that had survived 40 years of family gatherings, they all talked about change, about community, about the importance of remembering that progress shouldn't mean leaving people behind. We'd love to have you both involved in the Foundation's new initiative, Shaq said, holding a delicate china cup that nearly disappeared in his hand. Your experience could help a lot of other people." Robert, still somewhat starstruck, nodded eagerly. "We'd be honored. Though I have to admit, when Maria left for the bank this morning, I never imagined she'd come back with Shaquille O'Neal. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Maria smiled, reaching for her husband's hand. "And sometimes what looks like a problem turns into something beautiful." As the afternoon light filled their kitchen, Maria looked around at this unlikely gathering. The basketball legend, his tech-savvy daughter, her beloved Robert, all brought together by what had started as a banking crisis. She thought about Mr. Chun and his promise to review the bank's policies, about the young teller's apology, about all the people who had witnessed something important today. "You know what?" Shaq said, carefully setting down his cup. "Today wasn't just about fixing one problem. It was about starting a conversation that needed to happen. And sometimes, that's how real change begins." Outside, the garden Robert had tenderly maintained through his illness caught the late afternoon sun. Their old wind chimes, a wedding gift from 40 years ago, tinkled softly in the breeze. And in that moment, Maria understood that while the world might keep changing, some things remained constant. The power of kindness, the strength of community, and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how impossible it might seem. A month had passed since the day Maria met Shaq at the bank. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside First Capital Bank as she and Robert walked through the front doors together, this time not with anxiety, but with purpose. The security guard, the same Mr. Thompson from that memorable day, smiled warmly and held the door for them. The bank looked different now. Among the rows of ATMs, there was a new section marked Community Banking Center, with comfortable chairs and desks where older customers could sit down with bank representatives. Photos from the bank's history lined the walls, including some from Maria's own collection, telling the story of an institution that had been part of the community for generations. Mr. Chin greeted them in the lobby, looking more relaxed than he had that fateful day. "Mrs. Delgado, Mr. Delgado, welcome to our first Senior Banking Advisory Committee meeting." The conference room was filled with familiar faces, other longtime customers who had their own stories of struggling with digital banking. But there were new faces too, young tech experts, bank staff, and community advocates, all gathered around a large table. On one wall, a large screen showed Shaq joining the meeting virtually, his familiar smile filling the screen. "Look at this," he said, his voice coming clearly through the speakers. "This is what progress really looks like, not just moving forward, but bringing everyone along." The changes at First Capital Bank had started small but spread quickly. After the video of Maria's story went viral, other banks across the country began examining their own policies. Shaq's foundation had turned their impromptu intervention into a formal initiative, with Maria and Robert as founding advisors. "We've implemented several changes already," Mr. Chin announced to the group, standing at the front of the room. "Every teller is now trained in legacy banking procedures. We've created emergency protocols for customers without digital access. And our new community banking center helps seniors transition to digital services at their own pace." Maria squeezed Robert's hand under the table. His color had improved since starting the new medication, and today he looked almost as energetic as he had in their old bank photos. He'd insisted on wearing his best suit for the meeting, saying this was as important as any business he'd ever been part of. "But we're not just here to talk about what we've done," Mr. Chin continued. "We're here to listen to your experiences, your needs, your suggestions. Because banking isn't just about money, it's about people." The young teller who had initially turned Maria away, Jessica, was there too, now serving as a liaison between traditional and digital banking services. She'd taken a special interest in helping elderly customers, turning her earlier mistake into a mission for change. Sometimes, she shared with the group, "We get so caught up in new technology that we forget about the human touch. Mrs. Delgado taught me that every customer has a story, and those stories matter." As the meeting progressed, Maria watched the interaction between generations with quiet satisfaction. Young tech experts listened respectfully as elderly customers described their banking challenges. Bank staff shared ideas with community advocates about making services more accessible. It was exactly what banking used to be, people working together, helping each other, building community. You know what the best part is? Shaq's voice came through the speakers. This isn't just happening here. Banks across the country are starting similar programs. Sometimes it takes one story to remind everyone what really matters. The meeting wrapped up with concrete plans for the future, regular advisory sessions, expanded community banking hours, and a new program to pair senior customers with personal banking advocates. But more than the formal changes, there was a shift in attitude, a return to the kind of banking that Maria and Robert remembered from their younger days. After the meeting, as they gathered their things to leave, Mr. Chen approached them privately. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "What happened that day, it changed more than just our policies. It changed how we see our role in people's lives." Maria smiled, patting his hand. "Sometimes the hardest moments bring the best changes. Look at what we've built together." Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the bank's windows in gold. The same bench where Maria had sat in despair a month ago now had a plaque dedicating it as a rest area for elderly customers. A young employee was helping an older gentleman with his banking app, both of them sitting comfortably in the sunshine. "You know what Robert said to me this morning?" Maria asked as they walked to their car. "He said maybe getting old isn't about being left behind. Maybe it's about helping build bridges between what was and what's coming." That evening, as they sat in their familiar kitchen, Maria's phone buzzed with a text message. She had a new phone now, one that Shaq's daughter had helped her learn to use. It was a photo from the meeting showing 3 generations of people working together to make banking better for everyone. Robert looked at the picture over her shoulder. "Remember when you left for the bank that morning? All we wanted was to get my medicine. And look what happened instead." Maria nodded, thinking about all the changes that had sprung from that difficult day. The bank had rediscovered its heart. Young employees had learned the value of experience. And seniors like them had found their voice in a rapidly changing world. "You know what I think?" she said, reaching for Robert's hand. "I think sometimes the biggest changes don't come from fighting against the future. They come from bringing the best of the past along with us." Through their kitchen window, they could see their garden where Robert's roses were blooming late into the season. The old wind chimes still sang in the evening breeze, their familiar melody mixing with the ping of Maria's new phone. And in that moment, it felt like everything had come full circle, not an ending, but a new beginning, bridging past and future in perfect harmony.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.